Newsologist. One world, many views. Yes, some of them. So the major topic in Big Topic at the moment is a continuation of one which has been throughout the last year or so. And that's energy, price of energy, cost of energy, how much energy you use, and what types of energy you use. Historically, the UK has been able to supply itself with major amounts of energy. Previously coal, bearing in mind that there's huge coal seams in the UK, South Wales, Yorkshire, Nottingham, Northumberland, Durham, it's in Scotland. These have been shut down to a large extent in the UK. Power stations that were using coal have been mothballed or decommissioned and taken offline. Gas, which is prevalent in the North Sea in reasonably large quantities, has been used since the mid-60s or so, and now there's an energy crisis. Energy crisis is a world crisis in energy. Energy, and basically we're talking about oil and gas, and when we mean gas, we normally mean methane, natural gas, CH4. This is used throughout the Western world and other places, but predominantly because it's a distribution problem with natural gas. The cost of distribution forms a large part of the cost, and you need an infrastructure to either pipe it into industries or pipe it into people's homes. What we've got is a war, special incursion, whatever term you want to use. It's caused some supply disruption from Russia to Western Europe. Out of this comes an increase in the cost, the price of the gas. This is pushing energy bills up in the UK. The UK has a complex system of taxes, and it also has a system of energy caps whereby companies are not permitted to charge more than a certain amount over a certain period for a certain supply of basic energy. It sounds great in principle, but when it's exposed to world commodity prices in oil and gas or world commodity prices, then the system starts to show some strain. The strain is that the energy costs have went up. This in itself, in isolation, isn't a major problem most times. What you've got is another one of these perfect storm confluences. You've got a country which has racked up large amounts of debt. The UK government, as most Western governments, cannot support and sustain itself on the volume of taxes that it raises. Consequently, it taxes up to a certain amount, taxes up to the hilt before people start getting on the barricades and bringing the governments down. And it pushes the running of the government's finances into using debt, and it's bringing forward future production is debt to pay for present consumption. And it is consumption. If the government was using debt as a means of increasing production, making the country more productive, increasing productive capacity, then that would be a productive use of debt. That's not what the government does. The government uses debt to pay for ongoing current account. These are everything which the government has to pay for: National Health Service, Social Security, pensions, overseas aid, armed forces, support to local government. Everything is paid for, and it has an element of debt. The UK's national debt is north of 2 trillion. That's 2,000 billion or 2 million pounds. Huge amount of money. The government is reluctant, unable to wean itself off debt. No government has realistically reduced the debt burden. So you're faced with energy costs which are going up. The solutions are, we'll give everybody a rebate. This is what the current Conservative government has come up with. And basically what they're saying is, because the energy costs have went up, we'll pay everybody a couple of £100, and that would compensate you for the increase in your cost of energy. Originally, this was going to be a loan, and you would have to pay it back over a couple of years. This has subsequently been changed to an outright gift, and every sort of consumer of electric, domestic consumer of electric in the country is going to get this handout, rebate, gift from the government. Where does this money come from? Well, it comes from two sources. It's going to come from increased taxation on the energy companies, and possibly it's going to come from taking out further debt, which then has to have interest payments paid on it, and that will go on the government's national debt. From the energy companies' point of view, why would you invest huge sums of money in the UK if the rate of return is going to be lower than if you could invest overseas? Oil and gas is a worldwide exploration production. Why invest in the North Sea if you can take your investment money and place it somewhere in Africa, South America, Asia? It's going to gain you a better rate of return. Energy companies are faced with a wall of legislation which is coming at them, primarily associated with the new green, which is no carbon. Hydrocarbon, oil and gas. Basically, what the Greens' agenda is no oil and gas. Well, from an oil and gas company's point of view, that's going to put them out of business. The reality is something different. It's driven by, in essence, consumption, which is driven by the world population increasing, which nobody seems to want to take account of in any of the discussions. And it's by increasing standards, people's standard of living. Places like China, huge numbers of people have increased the standard of living. When people increase their standard of living, they increase their energy usage. World consumption of oil, circa 100 million barrels of oil per day. It fluctuates, it's a little bit more, a little bit less, depending on whether it's summer or winter in the Northern Hemisphere. But that 100 million barrels a day isn't forecast to go down. The Greens say we want to stop oil and gas. Other Greens say we want net zero. What net zero means is that you have to compensate for energy, any energy which produces CO2, carbon dioxide. Bear in mind that methane, CH4. When you burn it in the air, which is primarily nitrogen and oxygen, you end up with the byproduct of the heat, and you end up with carbon dioxide, CO2, carbon from the CH4, O2 from the air, and you end up with a little bit of water, H2O, hydrogen from the CH4, and oxygen from the air. This is basic chemistry. It's basic 101 chemistry. It's not complicated. It hasn't changed for any time, and this has always been known about it. It's a fallacy to think that this is some radical new departure and nobody told me about it. Anybody that's studied chemistry, and virtually everybody in the UK that's been to secondary school, has had basic chemistry. This is not a world secret. So we've got carbon dioxide, so you want to take it out of the air, so you want to have net zero. So there's two ways. You can either stop burning hydrocarbons, that'll stop the carbon dioxide, or you can capture the carbon dioxide and you can contain it, put it into old oil and gas reservoirs, possibly offshore, make use of reservoirs that are old and all of the hydrocarbons being taken out. And there's rough plans to do it with one of the fields up in Scotland, and I believe there's also talk about doing it with the Rough gas field, which was used as a balancing field by British Gas Centrica. The Rough gas field is offshore Lincolnshire, just offshore from Grimsby. This would involve major reinvestments to capture the carbon dioxide from industries along the Humber, possibly along Teesside, pump them hundreds of miles by subsea pipeline, compress them, and put them into the old Rough gas storage reservoirs. The only way that you would be able to pay for this is if you tax the producers of the said carbon dioxide. So you make all the industry in Britain slightly less competitive because they're going to have to pay this carbon tax than industries overseas. Places like India and China probably will not implement the same things. You're making the industries less competitive. But people say, yes, but we need to do this, we need to decarbonise. Where does the money come from? Where does the money come from to support your standard of living, if not from jobs in industry? Where does it come from? But what we have here is the tail end of this. What do we do with the energy costs? It is expected you have a couple of slightly different opinions. You've got an ex-chancellor, ex-Prime Minister, Socialist Brown, weighing in saying that the energy companies should do one of a couple of things, and that they should lower their costs. Lower their costs because the costs are too high. This doesn't seem to apply to all industries, just seems to apply that he wants to do it with the energy industry. The travel companies, should they lower the costs? Because they're the food companies, maybe they should lower them because they're too. The banking industry, perhaps they should lower. The pharmaceutical industries, perhaps they should lower the prices. But he says, no, it's the energy price cap should be cancelled, and the government should negotiate lower prices with companies. So you sit down, you say, you should lower your prices, and the energy companies say, no, thank you. It's a world commodity. We don't sell it in the UK. We can sell it abroad. You need to pay world prices. As soon as you pay world prices for wheat, world prices for corn, world prices for tomatoes, pomodoro. And he's likening this to the situation in 2009, where the banking crisis, where some banks were nationalised. Now, in Brown's assumption, they were nationalised to protect the consumers. Yeah, they were nationalised because, in some people's views, the banking industry run countries. There's a school of thought which says the banks run America. The banks own the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is the private central bank for the US. The banks have a huge say in the operations of the Bank of England, and the banks have a huge say in the operations of all of the banks throughout the world. So there's an element which says that this is stretching the truth to say that it was nationalised to protect consumers. It seems to be that when the banks make money, they get to keep it, and when the banks lose money, the government steps in and helps them out so that they don't lose money. If the banks had failed and went out of business, there's a compensation scheme up to £85,000. I think it's something like 250,000 US dollars in the States, whereby the government scheme compensates you for any losses if the bank goes out of business. But this was something that Brown came up with in 2009, and this was, to some people's point of view, one of the major reasons why the country went into austerity. The amount of money which was taken out on loan because the government, in essence, has no money, or it has very little money in its current account, only what it's getting in on taxation, unless it sells assets. The assets that the country had, the nationalised industries, have all been sold off years and years ago. So the government has little or no assets that it can presently sell to raise any money. Now, Brown says, blah, 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 it's always an emergency, blah, 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 let's ramp up the fear, major decisions, blah, blah, blah. And what he's saying is that needs to happen now. Well, Brown is obviously a socialist, and anytime you can give the Conservatives a good kicking, he'll take, because that's just the way politics is in the UK. It would be exactly the same if it was a socialist government and the Conservatives were in opposition. They would be coming up with some Looney Tunes suggestions on how to resolve the problem. So the two runners in the field to be the next Prime Minister or Prime Ministeress, basically Liz Truss is going to win by every poll which has been taken. So realistically, you just have to focus on what she's saying. So she's saying she's never ruled out giving direct help with energy bills. That's basically, I'll give you a handout to compensate for the increased energy costs. What happens if the energy costs go even higher? Does the handout just get bigger? Where do you get the money for the handout? Well, you borrow it. How do you pay it back? Well, you never do. You just maintain that debt. The banks love this. The banks and people that buy the government debt love this because they can make money off of it. The consumers enjoy having cheaper gas. The energy companies, why would you want to be in an industry where the government is telling you what you should and cannot charge? Truss is going to come up with a proposed change budget, blah, blah, blah. Bear in mind that she's been part of the cabinet which has agreed the budgets for the last 2 or 3 years. But things are so desperate, and she's going to be so different, just as Boris was so different, just as May was so different, just as Cameron was so different, just as Brown was so different, just as Blair was so different. just as major was so different, and on and on and on. Go back, take a look, listen to what each of these prime ministers or prime ministeresses have said when they've taken office. Take a look at their record, see what they've actually done. You'll find that what they say and what they actually achieve, there is a little bit of a gap. So basically, it's a contest. She looks like she's winning. Maybe I'll start rolling back some of the things which I've suggested, so I don't box myself in when I do become Prime Ministeress. So she's saying she's not going to make further commitments. She said she might be prepared to look at cutting VAT on the bills, 5%, 10%, whatever it is, 5%, take it off the bills. Yeah, it's a help. But if you've taken VAT off the bills, then you've taken money out of your tax take. So that hole in your tax take, where are you going to fill it from? Are you going to increase the tax somewhere else? Yeah. Property tax, maybe stamp duty there. Insurance tax, we'll put that. What about national insurance? Well, no. What about the allowances, personal allowances? Well, we'll just freeze them. Well, they're already frozen. Sunak's froze them till 25, which puts people that get rises and takes them into the higher tax band, puts more money at a higher rate to be taxed by the government. The government's done all of these things, all of the easy stuff has been done. So what are you going to do? Sunak says, and he uses words like moral and misjudgment, blah, blah, blah. Look at me, I'm more moral than you, stuff like that. But Brown, the socialist, said the government should pause any further increase in the cap and negotiate with companies to keep prices down after examining their profit margins. So if we think you're making too much money, we'll tell you what price to charge. Yeah, that's really going to work. You'll be able to force companies to do it by changing the laws, but it's going to cause disjointed economics for the companies. The companies are going to look to get out of the UK market if they're not making the money. And then to top it off, cherry on the top, let's get the old red meat out. Government should nationalise. We didn't say nationalise, you just said take into public ownership. So there's two ways you can do it. If you nationalise a company, you have to buy the shares out at a specific price. Either you make an offer, I'm going to take you over, shares are trading at 320, okay, we'll offer 350. And in that, all of the people with the shares get compensated for their shares, and the government then owns the company. Just like it owns bits of NatWest Bank, used to be RBS, and changed the name to NatWest because RBS has got a fairly toxic name in some circles. So he's saying that take into public ownership. So the government can just take over the running of the company without owning it. Let's see what that does to the share price. Let's see what that does to people's investments. Bear in mind that people that have pensions have ownership of most of these companies in the UK. Let's see what that does. But he goes on saying that the government should offer guaranteed loans. Ding, 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 ding. How is the government going to loan anybody money when it doesn't have money of its own? The government can't pay its bills without borrowing. So if it's going to offer guaranteed loans, then it'll have to borrow the money to offer as a guaranteed loan. So it'll then incur a service charge, interest payment on that. That'll then get heaped in, possibly not, depend on how creative the accountants are, because some stuff doesn't end up on the national debt because for whatever reason, some forward commitments, we're not going to show those. And he's saying that the government could just operate the essential services from the public sector. Go through the public sector things which the government has. The passport office takes you 3 or 4 months to get a passport. The NHS, which has been under government control since the late 40s, so 70 years, is in a difficult situation because it cannot recruit enough people to sustain its operations. It has to resort to getting people from overseas. And people are glad that these people from overseas have come to work in the NHS. Of course they are. But that says something fundamentally flawed about how the NHS is being run. That 70 years after it's been formed, it cannot, on an ongoing basis, train, recruit, and retain enough people to support its operations. There's something like 30 or 40% of the new staff which is coming into the NHS on a yearly basis are coming from overseas. There's 2 or 3 questions that people should be asking. The first one is a moral question. The people that are coming from overseas are being taken out of their healthcare systems overseas. So you're stripping out people from overseas. Their healthcare systems are going to be maybe slightly jeopardized because you've got the volume of people. The NHS say, no, we're bringing people where there's an excess. There's an excess of nurses or doctors. And a few years ago, prior to the Brexit, there was nurses coming from, I believe, Portugal, Spain, because they couldn't get jobs in Portugal and Spain and were coming to the UK. And people are thankful that those people came, and hopefully they've come and maybe they've settled here. Maybe they've made lives in the UK. Anybody that comes and wants to contribute, it's obviously you're welcome. But that's run by the government. And on one level, it's a success. But on another level, it's an abject failure. The same with the dental practices in the UK. The conditions and the prices that the government wants to pay to the dentists, who are basically private practitioners, they don't like. So they get on their toes and they walk and become private practices, and you can't get NHS dentists in lots of areas. What's the solution? There's various options that the government has. It can increase the prices. It can make it more attractive for British people to do that type of work. It possibly means an increase in taxation to support NHS and things like that. It means the government has to rebalance its book. It means the government has to reallocate resources. If the NHS and the dentistry and places like that are a high priority, then it means taking money from one side of their accounts and putting them into other pots. It means less money for something else. Or it means increasing taxation, or it means increasing the debt burden. The reason why we're in this problem is the debt burden. That's one of the major reasons why the country is in the financial situation it is, because people will not address the debt. As soon as something happens, we'll borrow more money. Now, in a time of war, conflict, you can understand that. But Britain, realistically, if you park the Iraq and Afghanistan and the other minor things that Britain's been involved in, hasn't been in a state of what most people would call a full-blown total war since 1946. What happened in Iraq, in Afghanistan, was small scale. The people that died still died, and it doesn't make any difference if it's small scale, big scale, huge scale, total war, world war, or wherever. There's a school of thought which looks back and says these were foolish expeditions by Britain, poking its nose into places that basically had nothing to do with it. There's a school of thought which says Britain is getting overly involved in a border dispute between 2 countries in Eastern Europe. Time will show whether that is a realistic or a true representation. Britain has spent lots of money assisting one of the parties in Eastern Europe. I don't know enough to understand whether this country, which is getting all the armaments that we're sending, is paying for them, or whether these are a freebie. Because if they're a freebie and Britain has to restock those items, then where does that money come from? Where does the money come from? The money can only come from taxation. It's our debt. No, to service the debt, you need the taxes to pay for it. You say, no, we'll just get more debt. We'll get debt to pay for the debt, that we didn't pay off on the debt. We'll just keep racking up on the UK's visa bill. We'll just never pay it off. That's on the assumption that somebody will continue to loan you the money. What happens is that your money gets devalued year after year by inflation. That's why prices, in essence, go up. No one wants to tackle that. Kick the can down the road. Leave it till next year. Leave it till the year after. We're only in power for 5 years. As long as we can sort of squeeze through that, somebody else's problem in 5 years' time. 4 years, 3 years, 2 years. Great, we got through that. The debt's now 2 trillion, 3 trillion, 4 trillion. In the States, they've crashed through $30 trillion of debt, and it's still expanding. A couple of years ago, people were talking the debt's coming up to $20 trillion. So in like about 3 years, they've 50%ed it up. They've taken it from 20 trillion up to 30 trillion, and it's still going strong. When's that ever going to get paid back? How much resources are getting sucked out of your economy to service that? Well, it depends on how strong your currency is. That's the problem with the UK. The UK has, to some people's mind, an overinflated value of its currency compared with what it's actually producing. The UK structurally is not in good shape. It can't feed itself. It has to import approximately 40% of its food. It can't clothe itself. It can't make enough clothes for the people. It imports clothes. I say clothes, well, that's not a biggie. It can't supply enough energy for its needs. It has to import oil and gas, small amounts, but it has to import them. It can't supply enough electricity for its needs. Imports electricity from France, Belgium, Holland through the interconnectors. It can't supply enough people to its major nationalised NHS. It has to import the people. This is like when people take a look at old sort of civilizations, fall of great dynasties like Rome and places like this, the corruption and the sort of corrosion from inside. You can't feed yourself, you can't supply energy to yourself, and you can't supply people to your health service. You have to import all of that. What does that say about it? None of these things are talked about. None of them. In reality, it's all short-termism. It's all, oh, well, energy bills, we'll have to give people money, we'll do this. It doesn't address the long-term needs. You've made the energy companies frightened to invest in the UK because you're basically the same as what the Democrats are saying in the United States. We're coming for you and we're going to try and put you out of business. Why would you invest huge amounts of money? When you do make money, well, let's go back. When you do lose money, the government doesn't step in and says you need to increase the prices. We'll do that to help you out. It doesn't say that. Like when it took the banks over, it doesn't say that. When there's a windfall, when the world price of oil and gas goes up and you make more money than what you expected, the government says we're going to impose an additional tax on you. Lots of companies won't invest in that environment. You can argue the rights and wrongs about oil and gas, but what Britain seems to want to do is not have anything producing in its own country, but import the energy from overseas. That doesn't change the carbon dioxide content when you burn it. It doesn't. Burning Russian oil or Saudi oil is just the same as burning UK produced oil. Slightly different, slightly different APIs and stuff like that, but slightly different content. But it's the same. Fundamentally, Britain needs to structurally revise, change what it's doing, not just on energy, but on lots of things. Will that happen? Personally, I don't think so. This is just another knee-jerk with Brown saying, yeah, rebel rousing. Let's fly the red flag and sing that red song that the socialists sing. Yeah, let's wave it round and nationalise. Yeah, it'd be better off if we nationalised the railways, we nationalised this, we nationalised that, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, let's nationalise the oil and gas companies. Yeah, but it used to have a company called BNOC, British National Oil Corporation. That got sold when British Gas, British Airways, British Steel, British anything got sold. When the government realised government's main thing is to protect the kingdom and to try and assist the people that live in the kingdom to have a reasonable, better quality of life. That's the only two things that the government has got to do. It's only taxed with two things: protect the kingdom and assist the citizens in the country. It's simple. Now, some people would say, well, the best way to do that is to nationalise everything. Yeah, well, okay. We'll end up with a communist country. Let's see how they work out. Some people say, well, look at China. China, in essence, is a benevolent dictatorship. Chinese Communist Party runs the country, and it says, let us run the country and we'll increase your prosperity. And the people in the country go, okay, we'll go with that as long as the prosperity and things get better, and we'll let you keep doing it. In the Western sort of liberal type democracy type places, and UK is amongst those, you vote for people, but in essence, your vote is semi-meaningless, because the people that you get in, whether it's on the socialist left-wing side or the conservative Tory right-wing side, are both the same. They both increase the national debt. The debt is what's causing the problems. Neither the socialists or the conservatives want to address it. Neither. It's all short-termism. We'll wait and we will find out in September when Liz Truss becomes, in my mind, I think that's what's going to happen. The Prime Ministeress. I can't say anything major changing. There'll be a few scraps off the table. Blah, blah, blah. You get a few £100 for your bills. Blah, blah, blah. You fill a few holes in. Blah, blah, blah. Things will just meander on. There'll be another crisis in a couple of months' time. Perhaps there'll be a resurgence, there'll be a different variant. For the last 2.5 years, the governments in Western countries have had a free ride, have had a free ticket. The economy has been off stage. No matter what's been going on, they've had a free ride because of world events. The thing which caused those world events is dissipated to a large extent. But you can be sure that if the governments get into difficulties, then they'll want something to divert people's attention away from the real problem. The real problem hasn't changed for 100 years in the UK. It's debt. The real problems won't be addressed in the UK. We'll put a few band-aids on them. We'll run around like crazies. The government will spend a lot of its time on meaningless things which have no real long-term lasting benefit. It'll get involved in minuscule problems. It'll spend excessive amounts of time on minor squabbling politic type things. Neither side in this, I'm agnostic on this pestilence on both the houses, on both the Reds and the Blues, because neither of them realistically are addressing the central problems. Like I mentioned, NHS, what's your plan to sort this out? What's your plan for there to be a surplus of people retained in the NHS? What's your plan to? We're going to get more people from overseas. Yay! Well, how does that? Where's the long-term solution? Yeah, well, it's difficult. It's easy for me to knock. It's easy for me to say this. What I'm saying is what's being achieved, and it's the same with the energy. Anyway, time to go and put the kettle on.